I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Churches of Christ in the Wrexham and Chester areas. And we're going to be looking from north to south on the map where you see the circles, about the churches at Allington, Sorrel, Chester, Saltney, Rossett, Wrexham and Roslanna-Shrigog. There were three streams, spiritual streams, doctrinal streams, which flowed into the creation of this small cluster of churches in that area. This is the house in which the movement first began in this area. There was a man called Charles Davis, who lived from 1760 till 1846, and he worshipped at an independent chapel in Marford in his early life, and family worship was a feature of the home in which he grew up. His future wife, Mary Hammersley, she attended the same chapel. It's worth knowing a little bit about the area. You can see these houses with the rather unusual architecture. A number of buildings have got these strange crosses, and there was quite a lot of superstition in the area. Thoughts about murder, haunting, witchcraft, and although nobody really knows, it's believed that in some way those crosses were put there to ward off damage from those dubious superstitions. Eventually Mary moved to Allington, and that is where Charles either continued or perhaps began to court her. 1791 they were living in this house, and it's in Cox Lane in the area known as Allington. And they had a carpet making, weaving and tailoring business. Well, they continued the practice of family worship, which they had known in their childhood homes, and then they extended that worship to their employees in their business. On Sunday afternoons, there was Bible reading, prayer and worship. This began from about 1793. And their neighbours began to be attracted, and they enjoyed the meetings. And in 1809, a church was formed. They had no preacher of their own, so when there was no itinerant preacher, they discussed the scriptures among themselves. And they came to the conviction that they ought to be baptized by immersion. They became convinced that this is the biblical way, although there was some robust objection to the idea at first. But the question rose, who should baptize them? So Charles Davis applied for baptism to the Baptist Church in Wrexham, and he was baptized by the minister sometime before 1809. So before 1809, they had practiced infant baptism and had observed the Lord's Supper. When baptism was adopted, they allowed unbaptized members to continue to take the Lord's Supper, but from then on, they only admitted baptized people as newcomers into membership and to communion. And they built a baptistry in the corner of the garden, but within a year every member of the original church was baptized. Men were baptized in the river. There you see the route which I suspect they took if they walked from the house to the river. That's an 1872 map, and that route is about 1 mile. Here is the river, Allyn, on the left. That is the point where the path I showed you leads to, but the stream is shallow and fast-flowing at that point, and I doubt they were baptized at that nearest point. Maybe they were baptised over the road with permission in the mill pond at the mill. We don't know. And within a short time, after 1809, there were more than 30 people coming together. Now, they are believed to be the first Church of Christ ever formed in either England or Wales. Charles and Mary's son was baptised by Alexander Campbell, one of the founders of the Church of Christ movement, in 1847, when he was attending a conference in Chester. People came from far and wide to the meetings, some people walking, some people on horseback, and the membership spread. Eventually they were breaking bread in 3 places, but they remained as one church. Sometimes there were more people than the house could contain. Charles's son John was aged 16 in 1809, and he soon began to take part in the preaching and teaching, later being joined by his brother-in-law William Worley and his brother, also known as Charles. When John reached the age of 21 in 1815, it was probable that they were no longer having itinerant preachers, and John Davis, despite his youth, wrote that he became fully entered upon preaching work that year. They opened a chapel in Rossett in 1866, in the part of Rossett known as Cam-yr-Alyn. You'll sometimes see the church referred to as being at Cam-yr-Alyn. Here you have the notice board, which used to stand outside the chapel: breaking of bread on a Sunday morning, Sunday school at 2:30, gospel meeting at 6:30, and a prayer meeting at 7:30. And here you see today the chapel, now a house, on the left, and there are still steps going down to the river. There used to be steps when it was used as a chapel, going down into the river for baptising, perhaps still just the men. I think those steps are probably new, probably though in the same place or very close by. The house itself in Allington continued to be used for some of the meetings after the chapel was built in 1866, and here you see some of the final people holding the portrait they had of Alexander Campbell. And that's how the house stands today. Empty, uninhabited, garden left untended. I believe the owner has moved to New Zealand. In 1817, Charles's son John, he married Mary Peters, whose parents were living at Tarrant Farm in Mollington. And they moved to Mollington in 1821, and for many years they lived at a house called The Willows. John worked in Mollington as a land agent and surveyor, but he continued to visit the congregation at Cox Lane once a month. A church began in Mollington, and its life centres upon his work. In 1821 until 1842, the worshippers at Mollington and Sorgall met at Tarrant, and then 11 worshippers asked John Davis to begin a fortnightly afternoon service at Sorgall, not splitting up in a factious spirit, but presumably wishing to meet closer to where they lived. The first chapel at Mollington was built in 1875, built of brick with a slated roof, and it adjoined the offices at Cross Looms. And there it is. That is an 1899 map. 1895, Davis bought an iron chapel rather than that brick one, which had more comfortable seating than the earlier chapel. There was a man called Peter Stephen, and he moved to Mollington. He had been an elder of the Church of Christ in Dundee. He also continued the link with Cox Lane by preaching there. In 1821 until 1842, the worshippers at Mollington and Sorgall met at Tarrant, and then 11 worshippers asked John Davis to begin a fortnightly afternoon service at Sorgall. As regards services, they were first in the home of two unmarried sisters known as Mary and Anne Furnival, and that's where they met for 7 years. I mentioned Peter Stephen. He moved to Mollington to help John Davis in business, you will remember, and he visited then the congregations at Mollington and Wrexham and Chester and Cox Lane. But his main ministry was at Sorgall, so Peter Stephen can be regarded as the father of the church at Sorgall. And they built a chapel in 1849 and enlarged it in 1865. I can't give you a photograph of the Sorgall chapel. It has been demolished, closed in 1981. But as I said, people were meeting in Sorgall from 1842 onwards. In that Mollington and Sorgall area, from 1846 to 1893, 232 people were baptised and became members. But by the end of the First World War, growth had become static, despite evangelistic efforts. In 1835, they discovered that there were other congregations in Britain and in America with the same doctrinal position which they had adopted. Before that, they thought they were the only church in the world that believed as they did. And in 1847, Alexander Campbell himself was a guest of John Davis, and he spoke at Shrewsbury. Visitors came from Wrexham, Roslanachregon, and as far away as Criccieth. So you can see that Mollington, Sorgall, Rossett were all connected. And by Rossett I include Allington. Here is the church in Wrexham. It began as a primitive Methodist chapel, and it remained as that from 1879 until 1911. And then the Prims moved to a larger chapel in Poyser Street, and the Church of Christ took over this chapel until it closed. It was still open when I moved to Wrexham in 1977. I don't know exactly when it closed. There was a Church of Christ in Chester. On the left you see its first chapel, and on the right you see its second chapel. That has also been demolished now, and it's a shopping area and a huge roundabout. They also had a cause in Saltney. The location of the first chapel is shown on the left. It began as a Welsh chapel, and then the Church of Christ took it over, and later they moved to this chapel on the right. That also is closed now, although it still stands there. So we have talked about the two streams, the first one beginning quite spontaneously at Allington and moving up to Mollington and Sorgall, and then ones, as far as I know, unconnected in origin, beginning in other places. But the third stream was Welsh. And what I'm going to tell you centres upon the village of Roslanachregon, which you see there, looking down to it from up on the hillside. That was a Welsh-speaking congregation, and it still occasionally has Welsh sermons and usually sings Welsh hymns. But mostly it has now gone over to English for preaching and reading and praying from the pulpit. The story begins at Zoar, which was a Scotch Baptist chapel, and theological differences began with the Scotch Baptists. To go into the origin of those, mainly from Llanfairpwllgwyn, would be to go too deeply into the past and also too widely from our story. But there was dissension among the members at Zoar. That chapel, by the way, is now a house as well. And some members left and began to meet separately on the first Sunday in 1840. First of all, they met in an upstairs room at that pub, which is no longer in existence, the Bull's Head, and they later on acquired that Welsh Calvinistic chapel because the members left the chapel and went back to the chapel from which they had seceded, leaving that chapel empty, and it's known as Bethel. And the Church of Christ bought that chapel in about 1851, and that is where it meets to this day. They had an evangelist working with them from 1915 to 1921 called John Nicholas. He was taking meetings in other places as well, including places like Allington and Sorgel, but he also served at the Church of Christ in Llanfairpwllgwyn, whose chapel you can see there. That, sadly, is also closed now. The photograph was kindly sent me by Christine Haslam, who lives in it now. The document at the bottom is part of the 10-year census, which tells us about John Nicholas and his family. So you have three streams. You have the doctrinal movement, largely emanating from Llanfairpwllgwyn and other places, reaching Zoar Chapel in Ponky, where there was dissension and people left and formed the church which now meets at Bethel in Wrexham. The one with churches at Wrexham, Chester, Saltney. I haven't looked into how they originated, but I believe it was a different and somewhat later stream than that origin in the 1790s at Allington. And you have the spontaneous beginning and growth of the church at Allington, moving to Rossett and expanding also to Mollington, Sorgel. So those streams flowed together. The church in Llanfairpwllgwyn had an evangelist. He was a member of that church called John Rhossydd Williams. You can see his dates there, 1885 to 1957. His father was a coal miner. His family didn't speak English, they only spoke Welsh. But he became a grocer and he learnt English, and in time he became an evangelist with the Churches of Christ. You can see there the dates in which he served, 1926 to 1957. From 1938 to 1940 he was sent to be an evangelist by the denomination in the northeast of England, and that's where you find him in the population census which was taken for issuing identity cards and ration cards during the war. 119 people were baptised in the first 5 years of his service as an evangelist. Here you see him speaking, probably not preaching, at an Eisteddfod. He was also a bard. And all of this makes me wish to repeat this prayer from my own heart, because I see a move of God in these people coming to faith from simple family worship in a farmhouse, and the way it spread, and the way people were brought to faith in Christ and baptized. This prayer, O Lord, revive thy work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make known. In wrath, remember mercy.